The year is 165 CE, and the Roman Empire stands at the absolute zenith of its power. From the misty shores of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of Mesopotamia, Roman legions guard the longest borders any state has ever maintained. In Rome itself, marble temples gleam in the Mediterranean sun, aqueducts carry fresh water to nearly 1 million inhabitants, and the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, has brought unprecedented prosperity to the known world. But something is coming, something invisible, unstoppable, and utterly catastrophic. The soldiers returning from Emperor Lucius Verus's victorious campaign in Parthia bring more than spoils of war. They carry a plague that will kill millions, devastate the empire's economy, shake its military foundations, and potentially mark the beginning of Rome's long decline. This is the story of the Antonine Plague, also known as the Plague of Galen, named after the famous physician who witnessed its horrors firsthand. For 15 years, this disease will sweep across the Mediterranean world, and its effects will echo through the centuries. The world before the storm. To understand the magnitude of what's about to happen, we need to understand just how interconnected the Roman world had become by the 2nd century CE. This wasn't some collection of isolated villages that could be quarantined. The empire was a vast, integrated system of trade, military movement, and human migration on a scale the world had never seen. The year 165 falls during what historians call the height of the Pax Romana, under the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor. He rules alongside his adoptive brother Lucius Verus in an unusual power-sharing arrangement. The empire's population has reached somewhere between 60 and 80 million people, with Rome itself home to perhaps 1 million souls, making it the largest city on Earth. The Roman road system stretches for over 250,000 miles, connecting every corner of the empire. These aren't dirt paths, these are engineered highways, some still in use today, that allow rapid movement of armies, merchants, and unfortunately, disease. Ships crisscross the Mediterranean constantly. A merchant in Alexandria can receive Spanish olive oil within weeks. A message from Rome can reach the Rhine frontier in days. This magnificent infrastructure, this triumph of Roman engineering and organization, is about to become the empire's greatest vulnerability. The very roads and sea lanes that bind the empire together will become vectors for catastrophe.
The Parthian Campaign and Patient Zero. Our story begins not in Rome, but in the ancient city of Seleucia on the Tigris River, in what is now Iraq. In 161 CE, the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival to the east, had invaded Roman territory, overrunning Syria and even destroying an entire Roman legion. This was an unacceptable humiliation. Emperor Marcus Aurelius dispatched his co-emperor Lucius Verus to lead a massive military response. By 163, Roman armies had pushed deep into Parthian territory. In 165, they reached Seleucia, one of the great cities of the ancient world, with a population of perhaps 600,000 people. What happened next is shrouded in conflicting accounts. According to the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing 2 centuries later, Roman soldiers looted the Temple of Apollo in Seleucia. When they broke open a sealed golden casket, a pestilential vapor escaped and spread across Parthia, Syria, and eventually the entire Roman world. It's a dramatic story, worthy of an ancient curse, but almost certainly mythological. The reality was probably more mundane, but no less devastating. The Roman army, hundreds of thousands strong campaigning in Mesopotamia, came into contact with a disease endemic to that region, a disease to which the local population may have had some immunity, but to which Romans had none whatsoever. The returning legions, victorious and laden with plunder, began their long march home in 165 CE. They marched through Syria, through Asia Minor, across the Balkans, and toward Rome itself. And everywhere they went, people began to die. The historian Cassius Dio tells us that the disease was so severe in some places that entire villages were abandoned. The military units themselves were decimated, and I mean that literally, in the Roman sense, where a tenth or more of the soldiers perished.
What was the Antonine Plague? Our most detailed account of the disease comes from Galen of Pergamum, the most famous physician of antiquity. Galen was the personal physician to Marcus Aurelius and witnessed the plague both in Rome and while traveling with the imperial court. His writings give us a clinical picture of this mysterious disease. The illness began suddenly with high fever that Galen described as burning the patients from within. This was followed by inflammation of the throat and tongue, which turned black in severe cases. Patients experienced violent coughing, sometimes bringing up blood. Their breath became putrid, a smell that Galen said physicians could detect from across a room. But the most distinctive symptom was what Galen called an exanthem, an eruption on the skin. Patients developed pustules that covered their bodies. These weren't just any pustules. Galen described them as black in some cases, in others filled with pus. Some patients developed so many that their skin appeared to be one continuous mass of sores. The pustules often became gangrenous, and when they dried, they left the skin black and disquamating, peeling away in sheets. The disease attacked the digestive system with equal fury. Patients suffered from intense diarrhea, often bloody, which led to rapid dehydration and death. Some ancient accounts describe victims literally wasting away in a matter of days. Death typically came between 7 and 9 days after the first symptoms appeared, though some died sooner and others lingered for weeks. The mortality rate was catastrophic, perhaps 25 to 30% of those infected, though this varied by location and circumstance. So what was this disease? Modern scholars have debated this for decades, and we can't be absolutely certain without ancient DNA evidence, which we don't have. But the symptoms Galen describes, the black pustules, the high mortality rate, the skin lesions, point most convincingly to smallpox. This would make the Antonine Plague the first recorded pandemic of smallpox in human history. Some scholars have argued for measles, which can also cause rashes and was equally devastating to immunologically naive populations. A few have even suggested a hemorrhagic fever. But the weight of evidence, particularly those characteristic pustules and the pattern of the disease, most closely matches smallpox, one of humanity's deadliest enemies until its eradication in 1980.
The plague spread. By 1666 CE, the disease had reached Rome itself. Galen, who was in the capital at the time, later wrote about the panic that gripped the city. The wealthy fled to their country estates. Those who couldn't escape barricaded themselves in their homes. The streets, normally bustling with activity, became eerily quiet except for the carts that came each morning to collect the dead. The crowded insulae, the apartment blocks where ordinary Romans lived, became death traps. Families packed into small rooms had no chance of avoiding infection once one member fell ill. Entire buildings were sometimes found empty, all the inhabitants dead or fled. The plague showed no respect for rank or status. It killed slaves and senators, soldiers and civilians, young and old. Even the imperial family wasn't spared. In 169 CE, Lucius Verus himself, co-emperor of Rome, died of the plague while returning from the Danubian frontier. He was only 39 years old. Marcus Aurelius, grieving for his brother and co-ruler, now faced the crisis alone, and it was getting worse. The plague spread along every road and shipping lane, moving with terrifying speed across the empire. In Egypt, contemporary papyri record villages losing half their population. Tax records show dramatic drops in the number of registered citizens. In some districts, the number of taxpayers fell by 30 to 40% in just a few years. Along the frontiers, entire military units were wiped out. The legions guarding the Danube and Rhine rivers, already struggling against increased barbarian pressure, found themselves fighting on two fronts, against human enemies and against an invisible killer in their own ranks. The disease even spread beyond the empire's borders. There are accounts from Germanic tribes and Parthia of a great mortality during these years. The plague knew no boundaries.
Interestingly, the disease seemed to come in waves. It would ravage a region, disappear for months or even a year, then return with renewed fury. This pattern, epidemic waves followed by lulls, is consistent with smallpox, which tends to burn through susceptible populations and then retreat until enough new susceptible individuals, usually children, are available. Society under siege. The social fabric of the empire began to tear under the strain. The sheer number of dead overwhelmed normal burial practices. In Rome, the traditional funeral pyres burned day and night, but they couldn't keep up. Bodies were buried in mass graves or, in some cases, simply thrown into the Tiber River. The economy ground nearly to a halt in the hardest-hit areas. Markets closed because there were no vendors or customers. Fields went unplowed because farmers were dead or too sick to work. The careful agricultural surplus that Rome depended on, the grain from Egypt and North Africa that fed the capital, began to falter. Urban areas suffered catastrophically. Cities, which had been the engines of Roman prosperity, became killing fields. Their very advantages, dense populations, constant trade, public baths, markets, became vectors for transmission. Some estimates suggest that urban mortality reached 40% or higher in the worst affected cities. The military situation became desperate. Marcus Aurelius was waging wars on multiple fronts, against Germanic tribes across the Danube, against the Parthians in the east, and against rebellious provinces. But his legions were dying not just in battle, but in their camps. He was forced to take extraordinary measures, recruiting gladiators, slaves, and even brigands to fill the ranks. Religious responses varied widely. Some saw the plague as divine punishment and sought to appease the gods with lavish sacrifices and games. The Historia Augusta tells us that Marcus Aurelius performed elaborate purification rituals and brought in foreign priests to conduct ceremonies to banish the disease. Others turned to new religions. This period saw increased interest in Eastern mystery cults and, significantly, in Christianity. Early Christian sources claim that Christians cared for the sick, even the non-Christian sick, while pagans fled. While these accounts are written by Christian apologists and should be viewed critically, archaeological evidence does suggest that Christian communities may have weathered the plague somewhat better than others, possibly because their practice of caring for the sick, even at great personal risk, reduced mortality. There were also darker social reactions. Scapegoating became common. Foreigners were blamed, Jews were persecuted in some areas, and Christians were accused of angering the gods. The plague created a climate of fear and suspicion that fractured communities. Price inflation became severe as the supply of goods collapsed, but currency remained in circulation. The value of Roman coins, already being debased by emperors desperate for funds, plummeted. Working people found themselves unable to afford basic necessities. The slave economy, which underpinned Roman agriculture and industry, was hit particularly hard. Slaves lived in close quarters and received minimal medical care, making them extremely vulnerable. Their mass death disrupted production across the empire. Through all of this, Marcus Aurelius struggled to hold the empire together. History remembers him as the philosopher-emperor, author of the Meditations, one of the great works of Stoic philosophy. But we must remember that he wrote much of this during the plague years, often in military camps on the frontier, surrounded by death and disease. Reading the Meditations with the plague in mind gives his words new resonance. When he writes about the impermanence of life, about accepting what we cannot control, about finding inner peace amid chaos, he's not writing in abstract philosophical terms. He's writing from the front lines of a catastrophe, watching his world collapse around him. "The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it," he wrote. "Everything is only for a day, both that which remembers and that which is remembered." These aren't just philosophical musings. They're the reflections of a man watching millions die, including people he loved. Marcus Aurelius made practical responses as well. He liquidated imperial treasures to pay for military recruitment and disaster relief. He established public physicians in many cities to care for the sick. He distributed grain to prevent starvation.
He enacted measures to encourage marriage and childbearing to replace the lost population. But nothing he did could stop the dying. The plague continued to ravage his empire for years, and he could do little but endure, lead, and try to maintain some semblance of order and humanity. In 180 CE, Marcus Aurelius himself died, possibly of the plague, though this is uncertain. He was 58 years old and had been emperor for 19 years, 15 of them shadowed by pestilence. His last words, according to legend, were, "Go to the rising sun, for I am setting."
The death toll and long-term impact. How many people died in the Antonine Plague? We'll never know exactly, but we can make educated estimates based on ancient sources and modern scholarship. The historian Cassius Dio, writing a generation later, claimed that in Rome alone, 2,000 people died per day at the height of the plague. Over the course of the pandemic, he suggests the total death toll in the empire reached millions. Modern demographic historians, using tax records, census data, and archaeological evidence, estimate that the empire lost perhaps 10 to 15% of its total population, somewhere between 7 and 10 million people. Some regions were hit far worse than others. Egypt may have lost up to a third of its population. Frontier provinces with heavy military concentrations suffered devastating losses. To put this in perspective, the Black Death of the 14th century killed roughly 30 to 60% of Europe's population. The Antonine Plague, while less deadly proportionally, affected a much larger geographical area and had profound long-term consequences. The immediate economic effects were catastrophic. Agricultural production collapsed in many areas. The tax base shrank dramatically, making it harder for the empire to fund its military and administration. Trade networks were disrupted for years. The military consequences were equally severe. The legions never fully recovered their pre-plague strength. This weakness emboldened Rome's enemies. Germanic tribes increased their raids across the Rhine and Danube. The Parthians became more aggressive in the east. The empire entered a period of almost constant warfare that would continue for centuries. Some historians argue that the Antonine Plague marked the beginning of Rome's decline. While this is debatable, Rome would continue for another 300 years in the west and over 1,200 in the east. There's no question that the plague was a major turning point. The loss of so much human capital meant lost knowledge, lost skills, lost cultural transmission. The empire became less resilient, less innovative, less able to respond to crises. The confidence and optimism of the 2nd century gave way to the anxiety and crisis of the 3rd. Interestingly, the plague may have accelerated certain social changes. The massive loss of life created labor shortages that gave surviving workers more bargaining power. The price of slaves rose, making slavery less economical in some contexts. Some scholars suggest this contributed to the gradual transformation from a slave economy to the serf-based economy of the Middle Ages. The plague also seems to have contributed to the spread of Christianity. As I mentioned earlier, Christian communities may have weathered the plague better because of their practices of mutual aid and care for the sick. In the midst of collapse and death, the Christian message of salvation, eternal life, and a God who cared about human suffering had powerful appeal. One of the few positive outcomes of the Antonine Plague was the advancement of medical knowledge, particularly through Galen's observations and writings. Galen documented the disease with remarkable clinical precision. His descriptions of symptoms, disease progression, and various treatments became foundational texts that physicians would study for over 1,000 years. Even though he didn't understand germ theory, that wouldn't come for another 1,700 years, his careful observations were invaluable. He recognized that the disease was contagious and recommended isolation of the sick, though he didn't understand the mechanism of transmission. He noticed that physicians and caretakers had high mortality rates, evidence that he interpreted correctly as showing the disease passed from person to person. Galen advocated for various treatments: bleeding, purging, cooling baths, and herbal remedies. From our modern perspective, most of these were useless at best and harmful at worst. Bloodletting in particular would have weakened already sick patients. But Galen also recommended supportive care,
keeping patients comfortable, ensuring they had water, protecting them from extreme temperatures, which actually would have helped. Importantly, Galen survived the plague himself, despite treating numerous patients. Whether this was luck, partial immunity from earlier exposure to a related disease, or something else, we don't know. But his survival meant that his knowledge and experience were preserved for posterity.
Echoes through time. The Antonine Plague eventually burned itself out by 180 CE, though there would be recurring outbreaks for years afterward. The disease probably established itself as endemic in the Roman world, killing new generations of children who lacked immunity, until eventually enough of the population had either died or developed immunity that it could no longer sustain pandemic spread. The world that emerged from the plague was fundamentally different from the one that entered it. The confident, prosperous, expanding empire of the early 2nd century was gone, replaced by a more anxious, defensive, crisis-prone state. The 3rd century would bring the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire nearly collapsed entirely under the weight of invasions, civil wars, economic chaos, and more disease outbreaks. But Rome survived, adapted, and transformed. The empire would continue in various forms until 1453, when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans. And the lessons learned from the Antonine Plague about the importance of public health, the interconnectedness of human populations, the vulnerability of even the most powerful civilizations to microscopic enemies remain relevant today. In many ways, the Antonine Plague was the first truly global pandemic in recorded history. It spread across 3 continents, killed millions, disrupted trade and military operations, and changed the course of civilization. It reminds us that disease has been one of the great driving forces of history, as important as any war or political revolution. As we look back from our own time, having just experienced a global pandemic that shut down the modern world, the story of the Antonine Plague resonates in new ways. The fear, the economic disruption, the political strain, the search for medical solutions, the spread along trade routes, the disproportionate impact on crowded urban areas, all of this feels eerily familiar. The Roman Empire never fully recovered from the Antonine Plague. It's a sobering reminder of how fragile even the most powerful civilizations can be in the face of infectious disease, and why public health remains one of the most important investments any society can make. Thank you for listening to this episode. The Antonine Plague may have occurred nearly 2,000 years ago, but its lessons echo through the centuries, reminding us that humanity's struggle against disease is eternal, and that how we respond to these crises defines not just our survival, but our humanity.